An in-depth look at public transportation in Detroit, what's going on in Lansing, and headlines of the week. MiWeek starts right now.
Detroit Public TV is supported by Business Leaders for Michigan, announcing open registration for the Michigan CEO Summit, November 12th at the Westin Book Cadillac Detroit. Keynote speaker is Tom Kelly, leader of a global design firm helping organizations innovate and grow. Motivational speakers, networking opportunities, and creative inspiration. That's the Business Leaders for Michigan CEO Summit, November 12th at the Westin Book Cadillac. Info at businessleadersformichigan.com/events. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there and welcome to MiWeek. We're so happy that you're with us. I'm Christy McDonald. We have a lot to get to this week: roads, schools, and an in-depth look at transportation, not only in Detroit, but around Southeast Michigan. But the band is back together this week. Our contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Guys, it's good to see you. A lot going on this week. Besides the Republican debate, which we'll talk about much later, also there's a lot percolating in Lansing right now, Nolan.
Well, we hope there is. I mean, at the
I'm
start
not sure
of
it's really
on Tuesday, you know, I made several phone calls. Everybody was pretty certain that they had worked out a deal the night before, and it was good by Tuesday evening. They were going to be popping the champagne corks. And once again, they walked in and started fighting over silly little things. And by this morning, they were nowhere close to it.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about roads in depth, but I don't think we're going to have a roads deal until I can use the old roads video that we shot last winter that has some snow in it. So that's kind of my bet. All right, so what else did you see this week?
Well, I mean, there's the debate, of course, is going on in Lansing, and there's the transit thing in Detroit going on. That's sort of interesting that we saw last week.
All right, so, okay, we have a lot to get to, but we're going to start tonight with an in-depth look at transportation in the city of Detroit and really our region. Detroit put the world on wheels, but doesn't have a reliable mass transit. Why is that? Well, you can trace it back to a stumbling streetcar system, emergence of highways, and really a city versus suburbs lack of regional cooperation. But despite a long and dysfunctional history, Detroit is now trying to make city transportation reliable again, one bus at a time. It's just after 6 p.m. in Detroit, and Renard Mashansky is headed home by bus.
For me, it requires like creative planning. There's always this, everybody in Detroit kind of does this 3-hour gap before you have to really go somewhere, allowing that much time for mishaps, buses not either showing up, or it could be anything that happened.
For his morning commute, Mashansky finds someone to drive him, or he calls for an Uber. He's lucky he can pull it off.
You know, there's not a lot of opportunities here, and if you don't have a car, your opportunities are even slimmer.
Basically, the bus should come according to schedule.
Ruth Johnson leads the citizens group Transportation Riders United, which has been grading the Detroit bus system's on-time performance for the past few years.
We have done a series of report cards and actually had volunteers measuring the departure time, and we expect that the bus will depart within 5 minutes of the scheduled time. And unfortunately, right now, it's only about 75 to 80% of the time that DDOT buses are on time.
It's not just late buses. With Detroit's fiscal troubles, bus routes kept getting cut. Then buses stopped running after 11 at night. Adding to the dysfunction, surrounding suburbs opted out of connecting to Detroit's bus system, leaving riders without crucial transit links to jobs. There was a time Detroit led the nation in public transportation. From horse-drawn trolleys to streetcars to the Michigan-built General Motors buses that replaced them. Former bus company manager Bernard Craig put the city's transportation history on the web. This is just an amazing wealth of knowledge on here.
You can do that when you're retired. No?
In the past few decades, Detroit's population shrank while the suburbs grew. Meanwhile, by the 1970s, bus ridership dropped.
I mean, Detroit was one of the first major cities in the world to own its own, well, at least I know in this country, to own its own public transportation system. And it worked, but now we tend to be one of the last.
While the suburbs that surround Detroit built their own bus service, attempts to merge with Detroit continually failed.
We were one of the first. Now we still holding on to it. Everybody else has moved on to regional transportation.
Now Detroit finds itself with a smaller system compared to other transit systems nationwide. Dan Dirks is now in charge of Detroit's bus system.
How does Detroit fit in with the rest of the country in terms of how our transit operates compared to other big cities?
Well, one of the biggest things is we really don't have the same quantity of transit that most metropolitan areas. And you know, there's a variety of reasons for that. But when you go to Washington, D.C., or you even go to Cincinnati, or you go to Chicago or Milwaukee, there's a greater level of transit than we have here in southeastern Michigan.
Detroit spends about $90 per person on transit a year. It might seem like a lot. It's not.
We're not comparing us to the Chicagos or New York, but more the Clevelands, the Phoenix, the San Jose. That average is about $300 per person. So just on that measure alone, we are significantly below in terms of funding transit.
When Mayor Mike Duggan took charge of the city last year in the midst of bankruptcy, he inherited a fleet of buses long past retirement age. Then Duggan had dinner with Vice President Joe Biden.
And he said, if I could do one thing to help Detroit, what would it be? And I said, we need buses. And he said, buses? He said, of all the things I thought you were going to ask me for, I would not have guessed buses was the first priority.
Duggan made the case that new buses meant more jobs for Detroiters in a metropolitan area spread so wide.
77% of Detroit's jobs are 10 to 35 miles away from the people who can fill those jobs and need those jobs. And what's good having a job if you can't get there? If you can't get there on time? They need a bus.
Federal grant money came through, but delivery of new buses can take years. Detroit got help from other regional transit systems in Rochester, New York, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. They let Detroit step to the front of the line to get their buses much sooner.
The transit world is really small. You think it's all these, hundreds of transit systems, but we try and look out for each other.
Detroit now has 80 brand new Flyer buses built in Alabama. They come with new technology like security cameras. 10 of them are the big articulated models, the likes of which Detroit has not seen in many years. Gene Hill is a route instructor with the bus company.
What's it like when a new bus comes in?
Well, the new bus, everybody's excited because everything works on a new bus, and you've got the new smell and everything, and it's just really a dream to drive.
The biggest problem now, the city doesn't have enough bus drivers. It's 3 in the morning, and this new crop of drivers are in training, some of the 100 new jobs in the making.
At the red light, we're going to make a right turn on to Gratiot.
Cappy Williams decided to make a career change after the nonprofit she worked for lost its funding.
You got to have a little confidence in yourself. Yeah, I was intimidated when you sit on the wheel, under the wheel, and it's like, okay. Just a little bit, but you get over that. You got instructors that get you over that hump, build your confidence.
The new buses and tighter schedules are finally starting to meet the demand for on-time, reliable transportation for a large segment of Detroiters with no other options. And Detroit will be getting a taste of light rail service next year. The new M1 rail runs just over a 3-mile stretch, looking to serve younger city dwellers more enthusiastic about things like public transportation. There's hope here. This is the beginning of something much bigger.
There is finally a regional transit plan in the works for Southeast Michigan. It would coordinate Detroit's bus service along with M1 rail and the suburban bus system. The Regional Transit Authority has been working on its master plan. The public has been allowed to give its input, but it will cost. And voters will have to decide just over a year from now how important regional transit is and if they want to pay for it. And that really is the larger question if people are going to want to pay for it. We'll get into the regional transit conversation, I think, in just a minute. But let's talk a little bit about Detroit and the fact that there's such that big push to make sure that these buses are now functioning and the buses are on time. Nolan, the importance of that right now.
Well, I mean, it's key if you're going to put people to work and get kids to school on time. A city, an urban area has to have a working transportation system. We haven't had one in a long time. I'm not sure we're there yet, but it certainly looks as if making progress, but people have to know when they stand out on a corner, a bus is going to come when it says it's going to come and take you where it says it's going to take you.
You know, and it's getting a little bit better, Stephen, but it really is that lifeline connection for people. And I think the whole conversation of, remember the story about the walking man, James Robertson, about how he had to take so many different connections to get to his job out in the suburbs, that it really is important for people who have no other option.
Well, and there's a lot of people like that in Detroit. A third of the households in Detroit don't have access to a car. Which is much higher than you see in other cities. And yet we have this bus system that's sort of a patchwork of two different systems in the city and in the suburbs, and it's really difficult to get somewhere on time. I heard a stat recently, and I hope I'm getting it right. There's only 22% of the population has access to public transportation that can get them from home to work in under 90 minutes. If you think about that, it's 1 in 5 people really in the city. That's a big driver of the unemployment problem.
I thought it was interesting when Mayor Duggan said he was with the vice president, and the one thing that he would ask for would be help about buses, and then the fact that we've had other states kind of step aside so that Detroit can actually get the buses that it needs.
Yeah, no, that was huge, and the new buses obviously run better and are more time on the road, less time in the shop. That was a big problem with the buses before, but also you're starting to see this sort of negotiation between the suburban and the city service soften a little. I mean, there's been a really nasty relationship at times between those two systems. The new RTA, I think, is stepping into the middle of that and trying to get them to work more cooperatively to try to make sure that there's good bus service for everyone everywhere. But you know, this is like a million-mile journey. The new buses gets us 10 miles down the road, but there's so much more that needs to be done in terms of those two systems, the availability of transit and stuff. I mean, we are years from fixing that.
So if we're years from fixing that, but we're slowly moving forward, Nolan, before we even get to that point, people would say, gosh, why doesn't Detroit have, or Southeast Michigan, have a good regional transit system? Is it does it go back to the cities and suburbs?
We've got a great regional transfer system. It's called freeways, and that's where we invested our mass transit money for years. We probably have a more vast freeway network than any other city in the country. The problem is
5 major freeways cut through the city.
Right,
I can't think of another city where that's
so. I mean, it's not like, you know, we didn't make that conscious choice, and it worked for us for a long time. I mean, but now folks are concerned about the environment. They're concerned about the availability and cost of fuel. In downtown Detroit, parking's getting to be a premium. You're not going to have the luxury of driving your car into downtown Detroit all that much longer if this comeback keeps going. It is right now extraordinarily hard in some parts of downtown to get a regular parking space.
Well, and you have to also be honest about the context for why transit is such a mess here. I mean, the racial divisions and the racism that has driven public policy in Southeast Michigan for forever has a lot to do with the patchwork of transit that we have, of the inability of Detroiters to get to jobs in the suburbs. A lot of this is by design.
Well, don't discount as well the corruption and mismanagement that went on in the transportation department for decades, and the fact that for a long time, I'm not sure it's not still true, it was controlled by some of the most absurd and regressive union contracts, restrictive union contracts of anywhere in the country. I mean, only Hawaii was more expensive than Detroit to operate a bus.
But the difference here is, I mean, you go to other cities, they have problems with corruption in public transportation. They have problems with the high cost of labor and things like that. And you don't have this kind of disconnected. You say that. I don't know that there's any qualitative way
you can measure the cost
of measuring that.
For a long time, we were the highest cost per mile.
But what we do know is that there were decisions made about Detroit and Detroiters that were based on economics and race that divided this region a long time ago. And our transit system reflects that more than it reflects anything else.
Well, and I think you still have problems with the fact that you have cities that can still opt out of connecting into the system, and
Absolutely.
so that you have broken links in the chain.
Right.
So let's talk about regional.
Well,
Let's talk about,
or you can say it's totally about these folks in these communities.
They don't want
use
people,
the system,
or they don't use the system. All right, so let's get to the biggest that big question then. So if you have folks that don't use the system, let's talk about the RTA and the fact that now they have to convince people, probably in about a year now, in 2016, that even if you don't use a regional transportation system, you should want to help pay for it, because having a strong public regional transportation system is good for the area, even if you don't use that. How hard of a sell do you think that is going to be?
Well, people are already paying for a transportation system, and my concern from the beginning about the RTA, which I think is a good idea, I think it uses the infrastructure we already have. It's the most efficient, least expensive way to create a cohesive transit system. But last year, folks went to the polls and almost doubled their smart tax. People who weren't using the buses voted to increase their taxes for the very reason you mentioned, is that it's good for their communities, good for the economy. Now you're going to ask them to fund a third system. I think unless they get serious about fixing what's wrong with the other two systems and have a true merged system where you pay one tax for transit, I don't think it has much hope.
Do you think it has any hope? Do you agree with him?
I don't know. I hear a lot of people when I bring this up that we're going to have this vote next year really sort of push back and say, I don't want to pay for another system. The truth is that if you go to other communities, not everybody has just one system. I mean, in Chicago, for instance, there are several different transit systems that handle public transportation in that region.
But they work.
But they work together, and that's the difference. And I think that might be a more reasonable goal for the RTA, is to get DDOT and SMART to function cooperatively in a way that people see the value in what they're doing and will support RTA. I think the trouble with RTA funding might be that RTA they won't have the routes and the actual transit that RTA is going to provide ready by next November. So people will be paying for sort of an overarching
so you're selling
it's like, we're going to get there, but we can't show you exactly what you have yet.
Promise to a community that really doesn't believe, because they haven't seen it, that regional transit will serve them.
Yeah, I mean, if you already had the bus rapid transit lines that RTA is talking about doing or thinking about doing, if you had a couple of those up, one up Woodward, one out Gratiot, and one out Michigan Avenue, I think you might make a stronger case to people that, hey, look, this is worth paying for. But without that, I think the sell is it's gonna be difficult. I mean,
you've got to make it. You've got to sell it to people as if and craft a genuine solution that you're solving a problem here, not just adding anothave layer on dysfunctional systems, because they're not going to buy that.
So if they don't get the money in 2016, what could possibly happen then?
Well, I mean, they'd have to keep going. I mean, the legislation creates this authority, and it doesn't go away if it doesn't have funding. It has some funding now. It's and let's give it credit. The deal that it negotiated last week between DDOT and SMART to expand bus service in the city through both systems, to reconfigure the funding, the federal funding for DDOT and SMART, is a huge victory. I mean, getting both sides to agree to that is something that we haven't been able to do in a really long time. So, I mean, it's functioning. It's just not, the funding that it's going to be asking for will be to start building these transit routes, and I don't know that you're going to be able to get people to pay for it until you can show that it actually works.
All right, turning now to Lansing and the never-ending road funding debate and trying to sell lawmakers on the governor's plan for Detroit public schools. It's all going to take a lot of money. So let's start. I want to start with DPS because we haven't had a chance to really talk since the governor's plan has launched, and now it's been out there for a little over a week now, Nolan. And there was some testimony going on in Lansing this week talking about that DPS is going to be insolvent by spring if they don't start to take some kind of steps. What are you hearing?
Well, who are the champions for the governor's proposal? That's what I'm trying to get at. Who is with him and pushing this? I don't see a whole lot of support.
He says that there's legislative support.
He says that, but I haven't seen
named anybody.
And you're asking for about $70 million a year, $75 million a year or more to be pulled out of the school aid fund. You're asking every other district then in the state to contribute. I think the money will be in the school aid fund. The school aid fund, as the economy recovers, has been getting stronger.
And that's what the governor's argument is. He's saying it's there. It's not going to be taking from anyone else. It's that it's going to be there on top.
And that's how it's going to be perceived. And you've got to build a better case in the legislature that this is the right thing to do. One, that this debt belongs to you, and two, the state as a whole will be better off with this investment. I'm not sure he can get the legislature to do this. I mean, he hasn't been able to move them where he needs to move them on roads, and I think this is a much, much tougher sell.
But when you hear testimony saying, "Look, we're going to be out of money by the spring," I mean, how can people maybe not act?
Well, I don't think they have a choice about acting. Number one, because of that. Number two, because the debt that he's asking them to take care of is the state's responsibility anyway. I mean, if you don't pay it now, you're going to pay it later, and it's going to take a heck of a lot more out of the school aid fund than what you're talking about. Again, I think that politically, though, you have got to start talking about what other districts might be able to do to solve their own problems through similar mechanisms. I mean, the DPS is not the only district that has the problems that they're talking about. What's driving the insolvency there is driving financial strain everywhere. The governor keeps saying that's a long-term conversation that we can have someday, but he's in the fifth term of his administration, hadn't brought it up yet. I mean, what's the point at which we start dealing with this at the root of the problem instead of sort of picking off branches?
All right, so if they can't get DPS done, can they get roads done? Because that's the other thing that's been going on this week.
They'll get some sort of roads deal done. I don't think it'll be the deal that it should be. It won't be.
What do you think it's going to end up being then?
Well,
what, 600 million from the general fund?
600 and 600, and they're going to use all sorts of accounting gimmicks to make that 600 million out of the general fund look like it's not really coming from anywhere. They're counting on growth. Maybe we'll have growth. Maybe we'll have a recession next year. I mean, who knows? But the truth is, it's a long time coming. This thing stretches out 5-6 years before it starts delivering the full money. So you're asking people to pay somewhat higher taxes and fees on the promise that they're going to get the roads fixed, and there's not enough immediate money here to show them a difference. They're going to have to, you're talking 4 or 5 years before they start seeing significant difference in their roads. I think it's a tough situation.
All right, so you think
it's one of the more cowardly acts I've seen. I mean, the House deal. I had a conversation with Speaker Cotter where I asked him, where are you going to get the $600 million? He said, growth. He said, our projections say we're going to get more money. I said, when's the last time a projection about more money actually came true? He said, never in recent memory. Well, right there,
I'm going to tell you, you're not going to get any kind of road deal unless the governor starts busting some kneecaps. He needs to today start calling lawmakers in and saying, look, you want another bill signed by me, you're going to vote for my road plan. You want, in next year's budget, where the deliberation is going to start very soon, you want this project for your district, that project for your district.
It.
I'm not facing voters, you are. You're not getting any of this stuff unless I get what I want on the roads, and he hasn't done that.
Have we seen him do that with anything?
No.
Well,
and that's why we're not getting a deal.
Well, yep. So we'll see what happens in the next couple weeks. All right, finally tonight, I decided to make these two work and bring in an interesting headline to talk about. Nolan, what was your headline that you saw this week that you liked?
We had our first combat casualty in this fight against the Islamic State. We have been told by the president for months this was going to be an advise and consent role only, that we're going to do air support and bombings, and now we've got active ground troops there, and you have to wonder, is this the start of another quagmire? Are they going to commit enough forces here and resources to get this done and get it done quickly, or are we just going to drag out and sacrifice troops for years?
I don't think getting this done and getting this done quickly is any option.
Massive
Either.
ground.
No.
I don't think
no.
They would. But either go in or don't. I mean, just dribbling in and putting American lives at risk in a half-butted effort, I think I think it's a mistake.
I think there's nothing quick about this, though.
This was a commando. This was a commando who was killed last week. And Ashton Carden stood before the Defense Committee last week and said, our soldiers will be in harm's way.
Yeah. Well,
and if that's true, then there has to be a better constructed strategy and a commitment to get this thing done and done quickly.
Yeah.
All right, Stephen, what'd you see?
The video from South Carolina of the security officer, and the story just gets worse and worse. Slamming a teenager, now it turns out slamming an orphan to the ground for chewing gum. It's more along the lines of this. We have a real problem with authority and authoritarian sort of attitudes that not just police. This was a security officer in a school. Why is that the way you're dealing with teenagers, and why is it okay? Even worse was there's adults in the room watching.
Who were just standing there, and it was interesting. People say, well, I want to see more of the video, what happened before and after. I'm like, I kind of don't think you need to see anything. More, right? I think you saw what you needed to see. All right, guys, we're going to have to cut it off there. Thanks so much. That's going to do it for My Week right now. There's more to talk about, so head over to MyWeek.org for our take on the Republican debate on Wednesday night. You can also find it on Twitter and on Facebook at My Week. I'm Christy McDonald. We will see you next time. Take care of yourselves.
Detroit Public TV is supported by Business Leaders for Michigan, announcing open registration for the Michigan CEO Summit, November 12th at the Westin Book Cadillac, Detroit. Topics include trends that could affect your bottom line and how well Michigan is doing in attracting and growing good-paying jobs. A great lineup of speakers, networking opportunities, and creative inspiration. That's the Business Leaders for Michigan CEO Summit, November 12th at the Westin Book Cadillac. Info at businessleadersformichigan.com/events. Funding is also provided by Delta,